introduction to UHI. We are, as of last year, when we published new policy and strategy, a one planet net zero university. So we have set objectives and targets to reach those targets by 2040. That's going to be very challenging for UHI, as it is across the public sector. But we have a lot of ambition across the whole partnership, and we recognise that our baseline is not where we would like it to be, but we've set out our targets, our objectives, our aspirations, our collective new vision in new strategy and policy, which is all on the UHI site. So for those of you who don't know much or anything about the University of the Highlands and Islands, there's over 70 local learning centres across the patch. So that extends from Argyll to Perth, Orkney and Shetland, Western Isles, Murray, Isle of Skye, Inverness. So it geographically covers a huge patch. We have nudging 11,000 HE students, over 25,000 FE, and a number of further ed and tertiary college partners, executive office. All of those are public bodies in their own right, and then under that federated model, that UHI banner, we also have SAMS in Oban, the Marine Science lot, and Highland Theological College. So our sites vary a lot. Those of you who work in the public sector will be familiar with a lot of these sort of types of buildings and the range of buildings that you typically have in education settings. Some of them, their characteristics are a lot of sort of concrete and glass and cladding. Others have more modern extensions. Some have more green space than others. So here we've got below sites, immediately below sites, executive office, UHI House, which is behind the hospital in Inverness. Below that, Leeds Castle College, so Stornoway, and you can see the green space there. The white building in the bottom centre is the Gaelic College on Skye. Next to that, immediately to the right, we've got one of the buildings on the Perth campus, and they've got extensive grounds. Thurso above that, and then Murray. So there is a lot of variability, and that's just a selection of the main sites. I haven't included Inverness on there because you'll be shown lots of slides and footage of Inverness. There's a lot of variability across those main sites, and that doesn't include the subsidiary smaller sites. So our biodiversity actions linked to what we have already published in policy and strategy and the implementation plan that accompanies those is the same as everybody else, to be legally compliant, first and foremost. We have targets to and objectives to baseline our sites, to understand what area we have available in green space terms, but also for me looking sort of vertically and also in terms of roof space possibly, in addition to what you've typically got on the ground. And one of our targets is to manage at least 30% of our available space for biodiversity, or to increase biodiversity. So there's a planning element for us and an operational element for us. We obviously want to meet or exceed our statutory duties, which sort of link back to legislation which Mareike might touch on, 2004 Act. We do absolutely get the multifunctionality around all of this. Importantly, multifunctionality as nature-based solutions and the role that they play for climate change adaptation, for insetting on site, and for health and well-being. We need to get smarter around using our own expertise and resources, selfishly for ourselves in a good way, and we'll be looking at what legal protections, covenants, others we might be able to introduce to protect some of that green space, some of those identified areas once we get to that point. We're keen to work in partnership, and we're also looking at things like UHI specific sustainable design and construction guidance for qualifying refurbishments, capital projects, new builds. So sustainability policies, priorities, I've underlined all those that touch on biodiversity. I think it's pervasive enough across the strategy. Net zero, already mentioned insetting, adaptation and resilience, cooling, surface roughness, flood mitigation, biodiversity obviously, use of resources, that includes land and what you do with it. You'll see there's a lot of tarmac and concrete on some of those pictures. Waste and pollution, travel, again, the multifunctionality element, learning, teaching and training. There are programs of work underway to embed elements of this, focusing around UN SDGs in learning, teaching and training, and also to align things with our research and our work on knowledge exchange. And UN SDGs will be what we sort of focus on, and the work around the One Planet institution sort of coalesces around. So there's my email address. If you've got any questions for me, don't hesitate to drop me a line. And thank you very much so far. And I will now hand over to Mareike.
So good morning, everybody, again, and welcome to today's Sharing Good Practice event. I am Mareike, and I'm an urban nature advisor with NatureScot. So we're talking about green space management today, and specifically we're talking about what actions public and private institutions such as councils and universities can take to help tackle the nature and climate emergency. Now, I moved to Stirling about 20 years ago to take up a post as an area officer with NatureScot, and we were based on the university campus at the time. And over that period, I've noticed a lot of changes happening. Now, I'll always remember, for example, our ornithologist in the office who used to be in a constant battle with the grounds maintenance team and storm out at lunchtime in a rage to try and stop the old trees around the loch from getting amputated. He used to say, there might be bats roosting in there. So we don't know if there were, and perhaps there were good, for example, health and safety reasons for what was happening. But it's just that things feel quite different to me now. For example, parts of the lawns are left to grow wildflowers, and the university grounds management team is working closely with the student union on making changes happen that will benefit wildlife. They've got a sustainability manager. And I think it's much more appreciated now that students and people don't just live in buildings, but that they live in a place. So having nature where you live not only makes the place more attractive and better for biodiversity, but it also means better water and temperature regulation, air and water quality, carbon storage, fewer greenhouse gas emissions, less noise, and so on. But when we're looking at the bigger picture, it's clear that nature still needs our help. So in the UK, for example, we've lost 97% of our wildflower meadows since the 1930s. And this is largely down to the development of land for property and changes to farming methods. But also our gardens used to be much more pollinator friendly. They were full of food and herbs used as spices or as medicine. And now, if we have kept our gardens as a green space indeed, we are more likely to have flower beds instead. So they're not all useful for insects, and fewer long grasses and hedgerows. We'll hear more about these plastic flowers later on from Alice. And so the need to restore nature is recognized by a whole range of national policies, including the Scottish Biodiversity Action Plan, the Scottish Pollinator Strategy, and our planning system. For example, we now have a national planning policy that says that every new development must have a positive impact on biodiversity. And this is the vision for urban nature in the biodiversity strategy. And the associated draft delivery plan, it's still at draft, sets out a number of actions for urban nature. So this is for the public estate to manage amenity grassland in a nature positive way, for local authorities to consider surface water management, including blue and green infrastructure, for blue and green infrastructure to be incorporated into new transport and active travel projects, and also for collaboration with homeowners and developers to better manage gardens for nature. Now, we have a bit of a focus on universities today, and you may have heard of nature positive universities, guided by the Global Biodiversity Framework that came out of the last UN Biodiversity Conference in 2022. So it's a growing network of university managers, staff, and students from over 500 higher education institutions across the world. And they work together to promote nature on campuses and in supply chains. And a few Scottish universities are members, including St Andrews, of which we have a speaker here joining us today. I think, Barry, you didn't mention that. Yeah, you were part of that. Otherwise, I would have mentioned you. But it's still very much, I think, early days, and the profile isn't very high of this yet. But it does exist, and more universities are joining. So you'll be hearing a lot more today about the specific things you can do to help nature and in turn provide better places for people. But I just want to finish with a couple of slides that illustrate the concept of multifunctionality, which is really important for managing places. So this development on the left, on the top left, for me illustrates the sort of green space that we really need to move away from, because it's essentially just a single-use space, and that is for car parking. The lawn is not really designed to have any function. It's just left over. It's an example of what you could call the space left over after planning or slope. And there's virtually nothing here that was intended to benefit wildlife, and virtually nothing for people either. You'd not really want to sit out or even play in that space, I think. By contrast, on the right-hand side, this is a similar housing development. And even in the absence of a green space or lawn as such, I think it still feels quite inviting and green. The outdoor space is designed for walking and playing, and cars have to fit in with people and not the other way around. So I think this is a really nice example of a multifunctional green space. It's managed well for people and nature, and it's from Strathclyde University. There's trees there to absorb the rainwater to prevent flooding. There's habitat for insects and food for birds. And there's ample space for people, for studying and for socializing. So it gives you a break from sitting in front of your computer. And there's loads of evidence now that shows how important spending time in nature is for our productivity, for our physical and mental health. And these multifunctional places mean there's also more people who want to use them. So in this case, it can attract more customers or students, and so the value of the property and the place overall also goes up. And then finally, I'd like to finish just with a slide highlighting that we now have a really good set of guidance on our NatureScot website. So Annex A on that describes 24 biodiversity measures that can be incorporated into development or used for managing existing spaces, which you can pick and choose from to suit your circumstances. Thank you, everyone.
So Alice Kenny is from Butterfly Conservation. Over to you, Alice. Thanks.
Morning, everyone. So just let this load up and just double check that if I move this, it moves. Is that all right?
Yep, that's fine.
Perfect. Yeah, so morning. My name's Alice. I work with butterfly conservation. So I am our Wild Spaces Perth and Stirling project officer. My role is really around kind of engaging anyone and everyone who would not normally be engaged with butterflies and moths, and just kind of give them that introduction to kind of who we are, and kind of what we get up to. The Wild Spaces project is a lot about kind of there's more urban areas, there's more garden spaces, and it's really our kind of call to action. We have lots of really scary figures around numbers of pollinators and how our insects are doing, and we give out these kind of scary figures around what our butterflies and moths are up to. And yeah, there's often that anxiety around, well, what can I do, and what how can I help, and how can I be part of a kind of a change in landscape. So with Wild Spaces projects, we really look at kind of just empowering people to do those things. So we have currently 2, about to be 3 projects on the go that go with our Wild Spaces. So we've got myself, Perth and Stirling, looking at more of those kind of publicly accessible, kind of more like community garden spaces, those open spaces, those kind of extra bits of land that have been, added to strategies to kind of support pollinators and just helping manage and tweak them into the right way for butterflies and moths. And then we also have that kind of garden and those like personal spaces, your own window boxes and things like that. And just giving the hints and tips around what we can get up to. Just as a kind of broader view at Wild Spaces, we also have my colleague Angus down in Bristol and Weston, and he has a schools focus. So we're trying to kind of offer those mix and match of different areas, all the places that you'd come up with, so we can have case studies and ideas and examples, what works in a real practical context. So not just us telling you this is what you must do, but actually us going out and experiencing it and learning from our mistakes as well, and going, right, okay, this obviously doesn't work. We'll stop recommending this, or we'll tweak it. We'll do what we need to do with the space. So yeah, I'm really just going to kind of have a very quick intro to butterflies, moths, how they're doing, and what you can do to support. I've tried to have a mix and match considering the different sites and locations that UHI has. Previous UHI student now get to go out and chase those butterflies, which is lovely. But I've kind of tried to mix it onto, where did we go through all our studies, all the different campuses, and hopefully that's a good representation of like what other people have as well, that not everyone has lovely big green open spaces. Some people literally have window boxes, but they can still be useful. So if you don't know Butterfly Conservation, UK charity founded in 1968, we're about the practical conservation, promote the scientific study of butterflies and moths, Lepidoptera, safeguard our important sites, so anywhere maybe have those habitat specialists that are really struggling, and just generally encourage people to think about moths. So we recently had our well-being studies, and that are just physically just seeing a butterfly or a moth flutter past you can have that really positive impact on your well-being, and yeah, the ability to do something positive for supporting our species. So for Scotland, we have 35 breeding species of butterfly. Those are our kind of regular ones, or ones popping about everywhere. We have a couple of migrants popping in, and then we might occasionally have some there's uncommon migrants popping in. And we have over 2,500 species of moth across the UK. So why do we want you to bother? Why care? They're lovely. They're lovely little things. They make us happy when we see them fluttering past. But also they do have, really important roles within our wider environment and our ecosystem. So we need them for all of our little feeding birds. If we don't have them, we have so many species that will link up, that are when they're having their young, links up directly to when lots of our moths maybe are having their caterpillars. So there's that kind of really close link. Our their environmental indicators as well for change. They are very quick to respond. We'll have maybe 1 or 2 generations for some species in a year, and with them reacting very quickly to cold and hot temperatures. We can kind of use that to judge how the rest of our environmental change is doing. Climate change is a big one just because they are so responsive. And we'll often use our big butterfly count, so as many results as we can get and as many people to do that, because it's that good kind of pulse point on nature. The more we can get in that kind of very busy, typically busy period during the middle of summer, it can give us a good insight to how our other species are doing as well, and how the rest of our ecosystem's doing. So yeah, how are they doing? We've lost 80% of our butterfly species abundance and distribution, so where they're found, numbers of them found. And it can pretty much link up to an 80% loss of habitat as well. Our habitat specialists are the ones that are really struggling. They're the ones that are generally not doing so great. That loss of that very unique or very specific habitat. However, our wider countryside species are actually not doing quite so badly. They seem to be doing a little bit better. We have an example of one of those. They seems to be doing all right. And how do we know? So we have fantastic volunteers. We have all our monitored sites, different ways for monitoring as well. So we have our very kind of rigid transect sites that will be monitored the same way year on year. We have lots of years of data to kind of back us up on that one. We also have our casual recorders, so those taking part in Big Butterfly Count, those that maybe use iRecord with us, or those that are doing our garden butterfly survey as well. So lots and lots of different options for recording it, but really fantastic, really knowledgeable volunteers as well. We do our State of Butterflies report every 5 years. 5 years is a good time. It gives us that kind of that variation where we maybe have those good years or bad years or weather. 5 years gives us a good kind of general view to look at. It gives us a good kind of data set to look at. So one of our generalist species that are doing pretty well is our orange tip. You can kind of pretty much see it moving up through Scotland and pretty much covering everywhere. Just with that climate change, as it gets a bit warmer, they're quite happy to kind of move further and further north with that food source. So you'll see the kind of lighter kind of orangey colours are those that are newer records. So you can see they're mostly popping up further and further north for us. Food plant for it is normally cuckoo flower or honesty or garlic mustard. So those weed plants that pop up everywhere. One of our favourites. I love an orange tip because they're so feisty. You see them, they're always kind of battling each other when you when they're flying around. But they'll also they're just so resilient. If they don't have the great food source available, then the caterpillars might turn cannibalistic, so that some of them survive. If they can't all survive, some of them can survive. Ones that aren't doing so great, so I've popped in some of our Highland branch kind of priority species, just to have that kind of, just for that UHI kind of area. So we've got large heath, typically found in those kind of like bog areas. It's kind of difficult to see on this one, but on that map, with those kind of blue dots that are blanked out, those are sites that would have had previous records but haven't been found recently. Although this is slightly out of date, it's 2014, and we do have some better. There's more kind of those blank dots are filled in now, with some more species popping over. But yeah, that's generally with the kind of degradation of peat bogs. And yeah, another weed plant for their caterpillar food plants. They're cotton grass, typically. Another one, paraborder fritillary, lovely little fluttery one. Caterpillar food plant. Another little weed is dog violet, and generally found in those kind of open woodlandy areas. And again, lots of those little blank spaces where there should be recordings, but there aren't recordings. And it's not that we don't have people recording there. We do have those transects on the go still, whether they're people that have set up those species-specific transects, so they walk them during their flight period and kind of with a window either side, or they're on those kind of generalist April to September transects where you pick up everything you see. And then our northern brown Argus, another lovely little one. So you really only get that where they're larva food plant, they're rock roses. So another few kind of those missing spots that it's not in anymore. This is a nice, just a one to kind of pop in. Common blue, it's really not that common. Yeah, 38% of its sites have been lost across Scotland in the past 50 years. There's a few of those blank dots, but this one matches up to what Mareike was saying about that 97% loss of enriched grassland. This one is where you would typically find that species in that enriched grassland because it's the bird-spit trefoil. But yeah, not one that kind of pops up very often. It's a nice little sneaky one. So its little caterpillar will look like its food plant, so it can kind of hide in there. It's kind of small, as green as the plant, and yeah, just sneaks in there. Hard to spot if you're not really looking for it. And another one, sorry, that has that 2 generations in a year, so it's another one we can kind of see. We get that early and later summer to see how it's up to, what it's doing. So our moths faring not quite as badly. So we've lost 30%, still a big loss, 30% since the 70s. And again, distribution abundance, so where they're found and the numbers of them found. And again, we do our state of reports, which can be found on the website if anyone's interested. And again, it's 5 years worth of data so that we get that good kind of big data set to look at. Poor years, good years. And our biodiversity stripes, just to kind of highlight that. So we're looking for those really dark green stripes where we've got good abundance, we've got them in good locations, we're looking for lots and lots of numbers. But what we're expecting is that if we kind of go on as we are, we're going to start to see more of these like really dark grey stripes where we've lost sites, we've lost abundance, that they're just generally not doing as well. So yeah, I've just kept this slide in, just we're chatting about those like front gardens and stuff, a loss of space. So within there maybe more urban areas, a lot of our green space is actually made up of people's gardens, buildings with those little bits of green space, and just how those can be managed can be so important. So I'm trying not to let the chat distract me. I should have turned it off, but I just saw a mention of holly blue in there, which I thought it's a really nice one because actually that holly blue is one that's been moving further and further north. Again, with that like slightly warmer temperature, feeds on holly and ivy typically. But another one, you know, if you're removing those, you know, those nasty hollies and ivies from your garden, why would you want those? They're messy, they're not great, but actually a really important one for a lot of our species. Yeah, and just having that within those urban spaces, these can be really good little refuge points. So just having, you know, a couple of nice nectar plants can just let our species connect with different species. It takes a lot of energy to fly. It's really tiring. You know, they're little bodies. They need fuel. So if we can just have those little, just any of those little spots can be really beneficial for species. So wild spaces. What makes a wild space? We say that anything can be a wild space. We want it to have one of these 3 things. If it can have all 3, that's amazing. But you know what? If you can only have one of these 3 things, that's also perfect. So we're looking for feed spaces, which are spaces for our nectarine adults, our breed spaces for so those little caterpillars, where can they get in and feed? And our shelter species. So what can they do maybe during winter, during bad weather, when they've got their chrysalis? Yeah, just those kind of safe places that things can complete different stages of their life cycle. So one of our life cycles, I thought that just looking at life cycles could be a really important one, because if we look at that, then that can kind of give us hints and tips for about what we can do for the, you know, when we're managing our space. So we'll look at a little orange tip, nice little orange eggs, our little caterpillar in there, tastes a bit bitter for anything that wants to eat it, so birds generally don't want them because they taste bitter. We have our little chrysalis, so this one's going to kind of have its, well, I say typically, but with such quick changes in temperature, you very quickly see that they're maybe struggling or doing better, or, you know, when they're coming out quickly changes. So typically you'd see them in about April, May. Right now they'll be into their chrysalis stage. So this will overwinter as its chrysalis, and you can see this one, it starts off nice and green, and then it's going to sit there all winter on something woody, something shrubby, and it's going to look like a dead leaf. And then we'll get back round and do our cycle again. So they'll kind of start fluttering about April again. So this is just one of those ones to highlight that, you know, if you were having that really clean space, or just like when you're cutting back all your shrubs, when you're maybe doing that hedgerow, and just cutting everything back, you would very easily miss these with machinery and things like that. But maybe just knowing that they're in that location might just give you that hint and tip that maybe it's not the best to cut that back at the end of summer. Because we often think about breeding bird season, but we don't often think about what our butterflies and moths are up to. So some of our breed species, we're suggesting things that are nice caterpillar food plants. So most of our species are going to lay on their food plant, and our food plant is going to be something that is native to Scotland and would maybe be considered as like a wheat. So a few good options for caterpillar food plants, we're thinking about nettles and thistles. So our bacillas are nice big strong garden flowers. The one we really love, those bright colourful ones. Generally you're finding them on nettles and thistles. Just not, it's absolutely tiny, but I wouldn't want to enhance the picture anymore, but there's a little egg in there. For our kind of white butterflies or our cabbage butterflies, we're looking for generally are kind of like cabbages, broccolis, nasturtiums, things like that. Nasturtiums are a great one. Just a nice good food plant for a lot of different things. Our garlic mustards are cuckoo flowers, so generally like our brassica family of plants.
Sorry, Alice, you've got about 5 minutes left.
Oh, no worries. So more of our kind of caterpillar food plants for like trees and things. So things like mostly just our native trees and what we're kind of looking at. Just something to consider when we're doing our shelter species. Different species will do their life cycle at different times of the year. So lots of our things will be maybe overwinter as adults. So having those like dead leaf piles, those dead wood piles. Within our grassy species, some of our species will actually be little caterpillars during the winter. So if you're cutting and cutting your meadows and cutting them back, maybe thinking about leaving spaces for those little overwintering caterpillars. And some will have our chrysalis during the winter, or our pupa, again, sometimes underground, so like compost bins and things like that, but also kind of bases of hedges and things. So just for our shelter species, I think they're well camouflaged. We're not really kind of expecting to see them during the winter. So just those little sneaky spots. If you've got those kind of really small spaces, those little window boxes and things like that, there's lots of kind of mints and things. Herbs, brilliant one for people as well as for if you leave them to actually just go to flower, brilliant one for kind of sitting on and for those adults feeding. Generally we're avoiding those kind of typical annuals, low or no nectar source, or the double flowers that just it's very difficult to get into. Some of our bees are quite good for they'll nibble the base of the flower, but generally our butterflies aren't really doing that. Different sized flower heads as well for our different sizes of proboscis. So just having mixed and matches and just avoiding those typically like short, quick, showy annual plants that are good for filling a spot, and maybe just opting for those more kind of like grasslandy plants. The only thing I'm going to mention about meadows is just kind of when you're cutting them, just trying to give that 15-20% of a meadow over the winter and just leaving it uncut, and you can rotate that year on year, so then you're not kind of having that enrichment of soil, but just a really good space for yeah, you'll get lots of things sitting at the base of grass, and especially those like tussocky meadowy grasses. They'll sit down there during the winter as a chrysalis or an egg, or as a caterpillar. So just when you are doing those meadow areas, trying to just think about that and consider that when you're managing them. Where are you going to leave a space? And yeah, just making best use of available space. So I'll quickly, just for time, for other hints and tips, we have a website, our Wild Spaces website, so there's more actual plant examples on there, but really the bulk of it is if you can consider a life cycle, and that just be aware that there's lots of different ones, then that's a really important one. But if you've got a space up there that you want to share it, then that's ideal. So our Wild Spaces website kind of splits it into little available spaces. And yeah, I'm in competition with my team down south. So if we could have more Scotland spaces registered up here, that would be great. That would feed my competitive instinct. Yeah, so thank you. Sorry, that was a very, very quick run through.
So hello everyone, my name's Johanna Willi. I'm Ecological Projects Manager with University of St Andrews. I've been there for 3 years now, and my main role is to support the university with their aspiration to manage their land more sustainably and for biodiversity. And we've predominantly done this over the last few years with 2 grant-funded projects, which I'll tell you a little bit more about. There we go. So I won't go into this too much because you'll have heard some of the policy background already, but for us, nature positive land management really underpins and is fundamental to our sustainability objectives at the university for 2035. It helps us reduce fuel consumption through our land management. It helps sequester carbon by creating more biodiverse spaces and habitats. Obviously, a more biodiverse environment also is better able to adapt to climate change, provides us with those ecosystem services such as flood alleviation and pollution filtration. And it also ties in with our health and well-being agenda for our students, staff, and visitors to our publicly accessible green space. So this is really just to say that these strategic objectives really help us sell these benefits of nature positive land management. How did we go about getting things started? First and foremost, and very importantly, is setting up partnerships, and that's both internally within different teams in the university. So the grounds team is very, very critical, and the environment and sustainability team, as well as the projects development team. And then externally as well, we've approached land managers in the surrounding area who have similar aspirations to ours, so that we can get more bang for our buck, work in partnership with them, create landscape scale improvements for biodiversity where we can. We then went about scoping out our university estate, and I'll show you some slides of what that looked like. Mostly looking at low value areas of amenity grassland where there was no short to medium term planning developments, proposed developments. And then we secured grant funding, and that was mainly for capital resource to purchase trees and wildflower seeds and machinery and tools that we need, as well as revenue for staff. So we've had a practical conservation worker for the last 3 years who's really been instrumental in looking after these new habitat spaces and managing them properly. So that's been hugely important as well. So the first project, which ran from 2021 to 22, was funded by NatureScot's Biodiversity Challenge Fund, called Meadows in the Making. And it really helped us facilitate a step change in how we manage our grasslands. These were actually the outputs. So the project aimed to create new habitat, to connect fragmented habitat, and also to adopt different grassland management practices. And this is just to show you that the cumulative output is really quite impressive, although we did mostly focus on small to medium-sized spaces. So these weren't huge spaces, it was just a collective of wherever we could find these opportunities. The second project, which we're in the middle of just now, is called Restoring the St Andrews Coastal Habitat Network. It's funded by Scottish Government's Nature Restoration Fund and is an 18-month programme. We've got 30 sites involved in this one. Again, it's led by University of St Andrews, but it's a partnership with 10 different land managers in the area as well. That includes farmers, private estates, Fife Council, Forest and Land Scotland, to try and create what's actually a 16-kilometre length of coastline where we're looking to improve green space management. And in this project, we're looking to create 2 wetland mosaics, which is new for us at the university. And we also are looking to improve the condition of 2 sites of special scientific interest with project partners. And we now have our own small herd of Highland cattle to help us do some conservation grazing. So just to tell you a bit about our grassland management journey, if you like, this is our Mareike mower, which is a cut and collect mower and was purchased through Meadows in the making. And it's really important to obviously collect the grass arisings. So to begin with, we started with very nutrient-rich amenity grassland, and that's cut sort of 16 times a year. And now we're cutting in the first 4 years, 2 times a year, once at the late spring when you get a very tall flush of grass. Cut that back. We try to tie in with no mow May as well, but sometimes we start the cutting at the end of May because there's quite a lot to get through. And then the second cut is at the end of the flowering season when the flowers have set seed. So that's pictured here. The grass is already a little bit dry. We try to keep the cutting height at about 4 inches. What Alice mentioned there about trying to preserve some stubble, if you like, for any caterpillars or bumblebee nests or eggs. And we also try and stagger our cuts as well so that there's always a little bit of shelter and forage left and we're not stripping that habitat away all at once. So yeah, this is roughly a 4-year program. And then eventually when basically you're stripping the nutrients from the grassland, which encourages wildflowers to flourish, and that should take around 4 years. We've definitely already seen changes. We have a student in place or an intern every year who monitors the botanical and pollinator diversity as indicators of how these meadows are changing, and it's been a positive trend so far, which is great. Some spaces the mower can't access, they're too steep, so we trim the grassland, and always great engagement opportunities here. Students are helping us to rake off the hay. We've done a little bit of seed sowing as well, mostly so that sometimes we want some attractive spaces as well. This is obviously, it takes a bit of time for these grasslands to start looking attractive. So on the image on the right, we sowed a ribbon of perennial native wildflower seed around the edges of our meadows. It was really stunning. A lot of people commented on it. And then obviously we can use that seed source as well to try and spread the seed into the wider grassland. That was rotivated. If you sow directly into grass, even if you scarify it, it's generally not as successful, which is pictured on the left there. That's not as successful. We also use yellow rattle quite extensively. So this, you'll probably have heard of it, is native wildflower that's a bit of a meadow engineer. It's a hemiparasite in grasses and suppresses the grass and helps other wildflowers to colonize. So hopefully you can see that in the image on the right where the yellow rattle seed is. You can see that there are fewer flowering grasses. So the ground was scarified over the winter. This is sown in the winter time. It needs a frost to germinate. And this is actually a council site in St Andrews, and they're mowing really nice, neat paths around the edges and through the meadow to make it an inviting and intentional space. We've also been using the green hay method, where we get donor bales from a really species-rich site. Here from Cool Den Local Nature Reserve managed by Fife Coast and Countryside Trust. You pick up the bales as soon as you can after they've been baled so that the viability of the seed doesn't reduce. Spread that out, ideally in some nice dry weather, and let the seed drop, or let the grass dry and the seed drop over a few days, and then remove that from the site again, ideally agitate it a little bit, either with a rake or by running the machine over it. So this has actually been successful at this particular site, and we've had some new species introduced, which is great. And they're obviously also local provenance. Our practical conservation worker trialed creating his own plug plants using a bulb planter and going into species-rich meadow and transplanting those into a less diverse grassland, including yellow rattle. And this has been quite successful as well, and is obviously inexpensive. So this is just to show you how we went about identifying some green space opportunities. This is the sports pitch area in St. Andrews. And the area to the north, the orange rectangle, was the former archery corner, which wasn't really needed anymore. So we planted 650 trees in there to create a small woodland. The left-hand side where my cursor is was a spoil heap, where we also planted some trees. This little rectangle here was just an underused area of the sports pitch. You can see the delineation of the pitches there. And we were told we could use that. So we created a small orchard, which I'll show you a picture of down at the bottom here. This is through our current project. We're looking to create a shelter belt or a tree line to connect these shelter belts of woodland and improve habitat connectivity there. We have red squirrels in this area as well, so we'll include some Scots pine to hopefully make that a beneficial corridor for them. And then this area here, the pink blob, is an area of waterlogged amenity grassland where we're looking to create a rain garden. So this was the woodland we planted in the archery corner, and we had schools and students take part, members of the public, and we do tree care with volunteers as well who weed and mulch and manage the dieback. So that picture there's the first year. It's really flourished. It's now in the third year. And beginning to look a bit like a woodland. We plant hedgerows where we can as well. These are always native fruiting and flowering hedgerows, including hazel, dog rose, hawthorn, blackthorn, crabapple. It really helps create connectivity across a landscape and provide shelter and nesting space, as well as nectar and pollen. This is the community orchard where, as well as fruit trees, we planted wildflower plug plants and created a native mixed hedgerow around the periphery. So that should turn into a little oasis over time. We're just in the middle of creating our wetland mosaics and have commissioned a consultant to design these. So this is just the first draft. We're looking for these spaces to be multifunctional, so provide amenity and flood alleviation value, as well as biodiversity value. So we're hoping to have a mown path through the site and picnic benches, and create a really nice space for staff, students, and visitors to use. This is just another example of how we went about scoping opportunities on green space. This is one of our project partners, Abbeyford Leisure, who manage St. Andrews Holiday Park. And it's a relatively manicured holiday park with arable fields surrounding it, and then the Fife Coastal Path to the north. And we decided we could create a hedgerow and tree line to the western periphery there, which was over 400 meters. And then there was an underused space to the west where the holiday park were really keen to introduce a wildflower meadow just to create a different kind of landscape for the park users and visitors. That also connects with the coastal path, so it's good for dog walkers to wander through. And then we created 3 small copses of woodland as well in less busy spaces. So you can see here, this is the hedgerow being planted. It was quite a gappy tree line. So again, 400 meters of that with that arable field adjacent to it will hopefully create a really important or really valuable linear habitat. And at the holiday park, we did decide to sow a meadow instead of a change in management, which is time consuming, because we wanted it both for our project partners as well as for park users to be really attractive in the first year. So that's only about half of it shown there. So it was quite an extensive meadow. We also put in infrastructure to try and support our local wildlife. So bird and bat boxes. We make hedgehog boxes with fresh ears every year. We create hibernacula for amphibians, log piles. We try to retain as much deadwood as possible in our woodland because it's such an important component of our woodland ecosystem for many species. We also plant pollinator-friendly bulbs, which is a relatively inexpensive thing to do. Crocuses, grape hyacinth, native bluebells, they all provide an early nectar source for bumblebees and other pollinators. On an engagement note, I know this was the audience is maybe keen on hearing how we get folk involved. So through Meadows in the Making, which really the practical side of things ran for about 10 months, we had 544 people take part through 58 different practical sessions, which I think is really quite good. We also ran 7 training courses with the idea of upskilling our project partners in the community. So that included scything, mowing, grassland management course, butterfly conservation, kindly ran butterfly identification and monitoring so we could encourage some citizen science. So we had 69 people attend our training courses as well. So the audiences include students, staff, as well as the local community. And just to end on some challenges and successes, creating attractive meadows takes time, and it's really important to communicate that this is a longer-term journey and to manage people's expectations so that they're not disappointed. This is Stanks Park in St Andrews in its first year. So you can see we've very intentionally mown paths through it, but it just looks like kind of scruffy grassland. There are a lot of homeowners around this park. We didn't have any complaints. We had compliments and people were excited to see the change and that there was a bit of more diversity in this space. We tried to communicate what we are doing through signage on site as well as online. So that was quite key. This is just to show you again that, delineating areas and creating these mown paths really make them look intentional rather than neglected spaces. And then another, at the beginning, obviously, the volume of arisings of this nutrient-rich grass is huge. So the composting areas were sometimes tricky to find on site. We sometimes had to move the cuttings to be composted elsewhere, but we did try and signpost what we were doing as well. Obviously, over time, as the grasslands become finer, the swards will become finer, there'll be less volume, and it should take less time to cut and be easier to manage the arisings. The successes we've had predominantly are, we think, the partnerships we've managed to establish, both internally in the university with the grounds department in particular, but also externally with lots of different land managers and landowners taking part in looking to enhance for biodiversity on a landscape scale. We've also been really fortunate to secure grant funding to enable us to deliver these projects. We've had a practical conservation worker pictured here, really taking ownership of all of these sites, getting the skills and experience to start managing these sites, which is quite new for the university. So we've been very fortunate that way. Engagement, as I mentioned, has been really positive as well. And then last but absolutely not least, even though it's a longer term journey, we've really noticed that even in the first year, you're creating instant shelter and some forage for biodiversity. We've had a hare regularly seen at our North Hall campus, or maybe probably multiple hares, using what still looks like scruffy grassland. We had a common blue butterfly. Again, Alice mentioned their decline. They've declined at our Fife coastline as well, and we had one spotted in one of our meadows. So it's really rewarding that although getting a really beautiful species-rich grassland takes time, we do see an almost instant benefit through these new spaces.
Thank you very much, Johanna. That was fantastic. That was lovely to see such a positive example on quite a grand scale as well. And it's clear that a lot of thought and strategy and a lot of resources and collaboration have gone into it. And I think it's great to see how you managed to get not just your fellow staff on board, but also a lot of volunteers. But clearly it took a lot of time and resources to make it happen, and a lot of patience. There is one question already relating to resources and labor. Any studies out there on the labor force required as a result of meadow creation? Does it actually save on labor when it is more intensive to cut and collect and compost arisings? And there's also the weed management. I don't know if you've already got any information on that on your grounds, but hopefully it's become a bit more hopefully it's a sustainable system.
Yeah, so we've been keeping logs for the last 3 years on the time taken to mow the meadows, the fuel required, and we've been monitoring that because obviously the time taken should reduce over time, as I just mentioned. And the fuel cost, and certainly compared, you're managing these spaces eventually just once a year instead of 16 times a year. So although we don't have figures for that yet, in theory, you shouldn't need as much resource in terms of staff capacity. However, the window for managing these meadows is obviously much smaller, the ideal window, sort of end of summer. So sometimes it's a resource issue in terms of if you just have one cut and collect mower and one member of staff who maybe knows the sites, then that can be a bit more challenging, making sure you get around all of the meadow sites at the ideal time from a biodiversity perspective, if that makes sense.
Yes. Did you have to buy the machinery? That was through grant funding, I guess.
Yes, so that Ezeki cut and collect mower was funded through Meadows in the Making by NatureScot.
David, to talk about managing SUDs for wildlife. Over to you, David.
Thank you very much. Well, it's very challenging now because there have been so many great presentations, so I could delete bits of my talk, but there's so many questions that I want to add bits to it. So this could be more chaotic than is even usual for one of my talks. So first of all, a little bit about me. I am, as that sign says, Biodiversity Evidence and Reporting Manager at NatureScot. So my job is to find the evidence and report on it, which is a great job because it doesn't mean I have to fix anything. I just see, oh, moths are declining, and that someone else can fix it, ideally Alice in this case. But it does mean I've usually got the evidence at my fingertips. The other thing that I do quite a lot of research, and a lot of that's been on SUDs, and that started when we moved to a new office building that had an amazing SUDs in the grounds. I noticed how many people were coming and enjoying this, and how much nature was coming. And this will form the basis of the talk, which will also include what SUDs are. The other thing, a little bit more about me, because I find me a fascinating topic, is my background is warehousing. I was a warehouse manager for many years. So I had a career change and went into nature and did a PhD in my spare time and all of that good stuff. So enough about me. Let's talk about SUDs. What the heck are SUDs? So hopefully the slide has moved on. Please tell me it has. Or nod your head. It has. Great. It has. SUDs. That's brilliant. So that's, I always forget what SUD stands for myself, which is very embarrassing. It's Sustainable Drainage Systems, or Sustainable Urban Drainage Systems, and they come in various flavors. The aim of them is to manage storm events in particular in a more natural way than traditional concrete and pipes. And there's some very good reasons for that. One of the main ones is that in the long term, they can be cheaper to maintain. Another is that if you have a pipe, you move something from A to B very quickly. And you solve the problem in A, but B then has another and then has a massive problem. So if you're downstream of a traditional drainage scheme, you're the one who gets flooded, which is not good. And it's been very successful. One example, for those of you who remember the Sheffield floods many years ago, since then they put a whole lot of SUDs type approaches in there, and that has greatly reduced flooding incidents. Floods still happen, but they're less severe. So types of SUDs. At the top we have, you can see a wet swale, and so those beautiful white flowers all over it. It slowly moves water from one place to another. Then you have a suds pond, which is very obvious what that is. It retains the water. Then you've got a permeable pavement, and you can see a wheel in there from the good old days when I could afford a good car before I joined for so much time with NatureScot. Permeable pavements in themselves are not particularly good for nature, but they're a damn sight better than a concrete pavement. And the last one is a gravel swale. I always thought, God, these things are useless. They look awful and they're terrible. But it turns out, and this should at least make Alice happy, that it turns out they're very good for butterflies like them. And she was talking earlier about how they need to bask and get sun, and that's what they will do. They'll sit on these, particularly things like dingy skipper, which is one of our rarer species here in Scotland, and warm up. They love them for some bizarre reason. Personally, don't quite see it. One of the things that people talk about a lot is the conflict between people and nature. And what I'm going to hopefully put in both in this talk is that you can have people and nature. So you can have brilliant suds like the one on the left, and we talked about monitoring these. Do not think for one moment these children are enjoying themselves. They are in fact engaging in top quality scientific research, and enjoying themselves too, but they are monitoring for suds quality, for water quality, using the creepy crawlies they catch. And this is a technique, something called OPAL, O-P-A-L, and we've used it, and you get every bit as robust results getting primary school kids to do it as you do using more, dare I say, academic methods and a bunch of students or professionals. So not only is it great fun, it's provides very useful data, and we've used some of this data in SUDS design. The pond on the right, oh dear, where do I begin? It's got a great big gate to try and stop you getting in. It's been mown within an inch of its life. There's no water in it. That is terrible for nature, terrible for people. Can you imagine looking at that? No, you don't want that. You want something like the left, and I've deliberately put in UHI there, partly to reflect the good work that goes on there and many other places. Where would you rather be sitting? Where would you rather have your lunch? Albeit assuming that the girls there don't try and nick your sandwich. You know, it's nice. You've got the sound of the birds, you've got the buzz of the bees, you've got the flutter of the butterflies around you in the margins of the pond. I also was talking about orange tip butterflies doing very well. They love pond margins because they feed on, oh God, what's it called? Milkmaids, Cardamomum pratensis. It's one of these plants that's got 120 different common names, but you'd know it if you saw it, and more importantly, the orange tip butterflies know it. So that's good and cheery, but let's keep it real here. One of the studies that we did looked at rich neighborhoods versus poor neighborhoods, basically, and the quality of SUD scheme that you get. So this SUD scheme is designed primarily to stop stormwater events, stop flooding, and to capture pollutants and nutrients, stop them getting down there. So it doesn't have to look nice. And when you're designing a social housing area, when I say you, not you, when people are designing them or maintaining them, they will often go for the cheapest approach possible. You know, they think it's a bomb crater that no one really maintains, and it becomes a haven for rubbish. As you can see, if you've got really good eyes or on a big screen, you'll see the crisp packet there is actually surrounded by frog spawn. So some nature has managed to survive in there, but from a nature point of view, the other neighbourhood on the right, which is one of the more affluent bits of Inverness, has got a lot more going for it from an aesthetic point of view. It's also better designed from an engineering point of view as well. One of the other things I'll add in, and there's nothing you can do about this, it might seem, but location, location, location. If you're a bird, you can get from A to B very easily. If you are a frog, it's not so easy, particularly in a town or a city. And one of the beauties of SUDs is they're often next to other bits of green infrastructure. And somebody in the chat was talking about community gardens and allotments. And when these are connected together, particularly with other bits of green infrastructure, something like a frog can hop from one to the other without having to go across a a major road. And what the map at the bottom does with the horrible splurges of colour, the green is where a frog living in one of those breeding ponds identified in the top, where it can get. You'll see it gets red very suddenly where you hit the A9 and the main roads, but there's a lot of ability to move around. And that's great for something that doesn't move. A, they can colonize new ponds, and secondarily, because you can move around, you are going to be you're able to find new mates so that you're not having to mate with your sister, which is generally, as the Royal Founders of Europe have found, not always a smart idea. So SUDs can be part of that, particularly if you manage the surrounding land. And I won't talk about meadows. I won't talk about some of the other habitat work because Johanna and Alice have done such a brilliant job on that. But if you can imagine, I'm a frog, I breed in a pond, but I move around in grassland, I move around in these lovely habitats, and that's true of a lot of other animals too. I just happen to like frogs, and that tends to be what I studied. Okay, so that's great. There's an example of something that I don't think you would wish you were there. This is bad design. It's not something that you or I can deal with as a manager, but things to notice: very steep sides. That means that the water rushes in. It doesn't get the chance for the soil microbes to break down pollutants in it. It also means the water levels fluctuate wildly. It also means that if you are there as a passerby or whatever it is, that is dangerous. And anybody could look at that and say, God, my kid falls in that, they're not getting out again. It's also heavily shaded. You can see that on the right-hand side. So the only thing that seems to be growing in it is blanket weed. This is not the worst SUDs I've ever seen. The worst SUDs I ever saw was near, I think it was Burnt Island. It was in Fife anyway. And that was so bad that if I'd fall, I can't swim, which isn't very helpful, but it was so full of toxic pollutants that there was literally nothing alive in this SUDs pond. There are situations like that, you cannot do anything with it. However, what I would say is, by and large, there's a lot you can do if you're building a drainage system. There's really good advice out there, and there's some links at the end of the talk to that. Syria produced a brilliant manual, and you start looking. This is the contrast to the last one. You've got a gently sloping bank. You've got vegetation in there. It's not too deep. If you fall in that, 40 mils, what's that? 16 inches in old money. You're going to get your feet wet if you go in there, but that's about, you know, I mean, I know you can drown in a puddle if you're trapped in it, but it's a lot safer. And bear in mind, people worry about SUDs. I say, oh, this is Scotland. This is one of the most, we've got more lakes than the rest of the UK put together. We've got lochs everywhere. We're surrounded by sea. A SUDs pond is not significantly adding to that danger, particularly if it's well managed. And I'll slightly more of that in a mo. We talked slightly in the chat about pollen, and yes, if you've got lots of plants, you will have lots of pollen. And I know hay fever is very unpleasant. However, what plants and what particularly hedges and shrubs do is they are brilliant at trapping and absorbing particulate matter. Now, like I said, I worked in warehousing and distribution, so that was an obsession of mine, making sure particulate matter, the tiny particles you get from exhausts and from wood burning stove and so on, doesn't get into people's lungs. So I would admit this might be a swings and roundabout argument, but an amenity grassland will absorb nothing in the way of particulate matter. It will blow into you, into your lungs, your children's lungs, and onto your clothes. Having a well-vegetated meadow or set of trees will absorb particulate matter, so that is very important. Someone else had mentioned ragwort. This is going off piece, sorry. Ragwort has been linked to some cases of food poisoning in horses. However, it would seem that a lot of it is down to bad preparation of hay rather than the ragwort themselves. So unless you're planning on putting horses on something, it is far less a problem than is generally assumed. And it's a lot less toxic than a lot of other things out there, like pelargonium, which I noticed was on Alice's red list of things not to plant. That's really poisonous. So I wouldn't worry too much about ragwort. And if you can get that across to people. Okay, a quick what I hate about this SUDS, and first of all, it's got a fence around it. I don't like fences. I can understand why, if you're next to a busy car park or something like that, you might want to have a fence, but in general, a fence does the opposite of what designers think it does. If you imagine yourself as an 8 or 9-year-old kid, would that stop you getting in there? Heck no, it wouldn't. You'd be straight over that gate or straight over the fence. If granny or grandpa is looking after you, they will not be able to get over that fence. So and if you're in trouble, you're then stuck. There's nothing you can do about it, particularly, I'm going to skip back and forwards, if that gate has been padlocked shut. As a little kid, I'd have been straight over that. At my age now, I'd have struggled a bit, and that is a problem. Next thing about it, you can see the grass around it has been mown to within an inch of its life. Very poor for biodiversity, as the two previous speakers have noted. Thirdly, the bit in the middle looks like it's never been maintained, because it has never been maintained. And that means if you're looking at that, it doesn't look too clever. There's not a heck of a lot of diversity because it is allowed to go to just a small number of species. And there's this is not news. I was at Darwin's house 2 weeks ago. He wasn't in, but in there on his lawn, there was a plot where basically they found that over time, if you have like your Victorian lawn, if you allow it to grow, first you get more species, then after 5 or 6 years, you just end up with a few tall dominant species taking over completely. So maintenance is required, and that's not happened there. Okay, one of the other things about having a fence is that anything that it becomes not mine. It's not my problem. I'll just chuck my drinks can over there, and it makes the litter problem worse. And they all tend to accumulate in these little corners, and it's not good. So a lot of it goes back to management and community ownership. It's making the people think this is my pond, not it's something that's been put here and I'm stuck with it. And putting a fence around it is the best way to make somebody feel it's not mine. You're always going to get bits of litter, that's the way of things, but you'll also get at the moment as a fence, I will throw my dog poo bag over the fence because then it's someone else's problem. That's something else we see a lot of. So where possible, no fences, and where possible, at least some sort of maintenance. So I'm going to give some good examples. I think I can't remember where that is. It is one of the universities. It might be Glasgow. Having a sign is great. Having that path as well, it gives the idea that this is being maintained for something. It also means I can go there, and from the tick point of view, I'm in the short grass. I'm not going to get ticked. My dog might when it goes romping through there, but there's only so much you can do. But it also makes it look inviting. Native broadleaf trees and shrubs, great for pollinators, great for butterflies, a whole host of insects, as pointed out earlier. When it comes to planting and maintenance, though, try and avoid anything that is going to be to the south of the water feature, because that will cause shading and reduce the biodiversity. Shading up here in Scotland, as you can appreciate, whilst it's great if you're in Italy or whatever, in Scotland, you want that sunlight when you can get it, as does the wildlife that we have got. All right, timing of management. There's always a downside to everything. But by and large, pond management, October to February. All right, I'd want you to imagine, there you are. First of all, bear in mind that virtually all animals in Scotland breed in spring or summer. Not all, virtually all. So there you are. You've gone to the Premier Inn. You've booked the luxury suite Premier Inn. You've got the Barry White music, or whatever people play these days. You're there with your significant other. You're looking for your romantic day. And then what happens? Room service come in and start tidying the room up around you. That is going to put you off, let's face it. And the same is true if you're a frog or a dragonfly or a bird. You don't want that. And if you're disturbed later in the season, yeah, fine, you'll go away, you'll come back. But if you're in the breeding season, that disturbance could be a major factor. Typically, frogs in Scotland will start breeding, depending on where you are, about March time. Dragonflies, April onwards, depending on the species, birds again April through to the fledge of the nests in late summer. All of these things, like those bits along rushes or horsetails and so on, they'll benefit from them. But if you are cutting them back later in the year, you're going to be less disturbance. The other thing is, if you are taking out vegetation, I do recommend that you do gentle maintenance. What you often see, basically, once you've taken your blankweed or anything is out of it, if you've got a composting place, take it to the compost, because otherwise all the nutrients that have been captured by that will run back into the pond and cause an algal bloom the following spring, which you don't want. People understandably don't tend to like algal blooms. It smells bad. Dog doesn't like it. Not good for general nature. So where possible, if you've got composting either on site, which can be great for things like slow worm, for example, or off-site as part of a wider site maintenance program. Quick bit about signage. We've already said about that. Basically, if you've got a patch of bare earth, it looks awful. If you've got a sign explaining why it's a patch of bare earth, people get it, people understand it, and that's people are far less likely to complain. Also, and this is the creme de la creme, this is Oxgangs Lochan in Edinburgh. If you've got a sign that tells people what they might see, it becomes even more of a value. And in a university setting, we've got species, I mean, for example, I mentioned dragonflies and damselflies. They've been knocking around since the Jurassic. So they're a fascinating thing to study, and also amazing, they're right, that they can, a SUDS pond can become a learning resource as well as being a biodiversity resource and a place to relax. So, oh yes, for those of you who remember the old Carlsberg's adverts, there we go. Can we do better for wildlife? And I would say that we can, and there's some brilliant examples, and this is one of my favorites. Again, this is UHI, so Barry will hopefully be having a slight glow of pride there. But look at that diversity of wildflowers. It looks nice. You can see it's accessible to people. You've got some big boulders in there, which are great for, again, a lot of dragonflies, butterflies like to bask on them. And you've got that varied topography, which I think is appealing. Now, I am going to try and share a brief film, for which I must thank colleagues at Cairngorms National Park.
SUDs, sustainable drainage systems, or sustainable urban drainage systems. They were originally developed as a means of drainage to prevent floods, to capture stormwater events, and also to prevent pollutants being washed out into wider aquatic ecosystems such as rivers, burns, ponds and so forth. So they have a very good engineering justification. But interestingly, we've found, particularly from studies here in Inverness, that they can also benefit biodiversity, and they can be good for people. They become a relaxing place where you can go perhaps on your lunch break to take a break, or perhaps after work to enjoy nature and get some relaxation. Interestingly, many of the characteristics that make them good from an engineering point of view also are good for nature. So for SUDs to work well, you want a gentle slope. Gentle slopes are good from an engineering point of view because they mean that the water passes slowly into the pond, which gives microbes in the soil time to break it down. It also means that it's not a sudden flood of water going in and overwhelming the SUDs. That's good from engineering. For a biodiversity point of view, from a nature point of view, these same gentle slopes are very good for wildlife. They allow creatures like frogs to emerge from the pond safely. From a human point of view, they also make it safer. You don't want a steep slope where there's a risk of children, or quite frankly adults, slipping and falling into the water. I like SUDs, I don't want to fall into one. Another good feature from an engineering point of view are plants along the margins of the pond. These also slow the flow of water, and they can absorb some of the pollutants and nutrients which in excess can damage burns, and particularly up here in the Highlands, salmon rivers. The plants as well, of course, are good for nature. They are nature, but having a variety of plants there can support a whole selection of different animals. So many of these features, as I say, benefit both. Another feature is that Suds Pond's depth changes over the season. That's what it's designed to do. After a storm event, it will gradually rise, and over time that water level will go down. Now, from a nature point of view, that's great. It stops certain invasive species becoming established and allows you to get a great diversity of native plants, and with those native plants, the animals that depend upon them. From a human point of view as well, this diversity of plants means you've got different flowers flowering at different times of the season. And you also have dragonflies and other creatures that people quite like to see. And of course, from an educational point of view, they're brilliant for children. I don't know about you, but as a child, one of my memories is looking at tadpoles growing up, turning into frogs. Perfect. Nowadays, many people are cut off from nature, and having these experiences is an amazing way to get in touch with nature. In Scotland, we're justifiably proud of a lot of the nature that we have here. And one of the best places for nature, one of the best habitats, ponds. Unfortunately though, the number of ponds in Scotland and in Europe as a whole has gone down severely over the last 100 years. We don't use them for livestock anymore. Most of us have cars, very few of us go to work on a horse. So we don't need as many ponds. And this means there are fewer ponds. And unfortunately, this means there's less wildlife. Can a Suds pond, something that's designed from an engineering point of view, replace these ponds? Here we're in the heart of the Cairngorms National Park, the largest national park in Scotland, a place with some amazing nature. This pond is host to the northern damselfly. It's an endangered species. It's one of the rarest insects in the country. You can also see there's a variety of plants, and these plants, some of them come to flower at different times. There's frogs, there's newts, there's a whole variety of things living in here. Surely we should be aiming to design and maintain Suds that can mirror this amazing diversity. Can we design this? Can we manage this? It looks like we already have. This is a Suds pond right next to a car park. The nearest neighbours are an Aldi and a Costa. So you can literally go and get your cup of coffee and watch the amazing nature that's around you. I've set a challenge, but I think this is something that we can achieve everywhere in Scotland.